Terminates, how a bile titan is the same species as a shreaker. What I will be talking about: terminid eggs and spores, terminid larvae and the mold, caste system and metamorphosis, the hunter caste, the bile caste, the warrior caste, the charger caste, the possible flying caste, tunnels and the hive lords, and finally E-710 and the mobility problem. Terminid eggs. What is in a terminid egg? Well, since we don't see very many terminid eggs compared to how many terminids we do see, that only leads me to believe that there are a ton, like hundreds or even thousands of larvae in there, in each egg. I mean, it's got more larvae than those leftovers you meant to throw but have just sitting on the counter for like 2 weeks. You need to throw that out, by the way. So then, what lays the terminid eggs? Well, in my humble opinion, I believe it is the nursing spewer that does the job. So then you may be wondering, why not put the eggs underground in those extensive tunnel networks that the terminids obviously have? In my estimation, that is because of terminid spores. So, what makes the spores? I believe the spores are made by those big ol' spore spewer mushrooms, and possibly some underground, previously unseen form of terminid because of the haze you can see around some of those bigger nests, but I'm not totally confident on that one. So, what do the spores do exactly? I believe they act as a germination. They serve the role like pollen or like fish, so that the larger colonies with the capability to build these large spore towers will spread their genes around to the other hives on the planet, so they fertilize the eggs. So that's how they fit into the life cycle. Next up is terminid larva. What is a terminid larva? A terminid larva is the last universal form of terminids, meaning that at this point is where they diversify into their various forms and castes. So, if there's so many in the eggs, why don't we see more of them? I believe it is because when the eggs hatch or are about to hatch, they are brought underground to nurseries where the larvae, once hatched, will be taken care of. And lastly, why is it a common sample? It's because Super Earth wants to study terminid growth and development, as well as start new, safer E-710 farms. Next up, the mold. What is it? The mold is this weird yellowish green substance scattered over most areas of terminid concentration. Okay, so where does it come from? I've got 3 theories on that. My first thought was, oh, it's spore residue, but that doesn't make sense since you'd expect it to be absolutely caking anything and everything near those giant spore towers. But they aren't, so that can't be the reason. My next thought was it might be terminid excrement, but that also doesn't make too much sense either because it's kind of evenly spread everywhere in these weird lines and forms these long, stringy, vine-looking things. So, what do I think it is? I believe it is a symbiotic organism that lives with the terminids, that consumes any excrement or dead terminids or debris from things that the terminids have killed or eaten, and any other terminid byproduct. In return, they keep terminid nests clean. Next up, we've got the terminid caste system. So, why have a caste system instead of, say, having multiple different species? It's because you want to have all of your creatures have the same genes so that even if only one survives, you're not down some of your creature types, as well as not requiring multiple separate and parallel reproductive systems. The caste system will work by every terminid emitting a certain pheromone corresponding to its caste. Then, as the larvae develop, it will use, depending on how much of a pheromone it receives, plus bias, it will choose which form to go into using epigenetics. So, how do new casts come to be? Like the bile cast, which didn't exist in the first galactic war. It seems likely to me that the Terminid genetics are highly flexible and resilient to mutation. And when I say resilient, I mean resilient to mutation making non-viable Terminids. So, how do new casts come to be? Under the right conditions, Terminids may pick up certain genes from their environment and spontaneously create a new cast. But that's all theory crafting. Next is Terminid metamorphosis. Why do I think that Terminids metamorphose? Well, it's because if Terminids were to smoothly grow from one form to another, say from warrior to commander, we would expect to see larger and redder warriors and smaller and weaker brood commanders. So, if Terminids metamorphose, why don't we see cocoons? It's likely because they all move underground into the nurseries to metamorphose. It's because Terminids are already moving down and up through there to bring food to the larva. So why aren't all the Terminids in their eldest form? Logistically, it doesn't make much sense. It would be wasteful to have brood commanders digging around through scraps, or bile titans killing lone, unarmed humans. Additionally, if an individual Terminid has a genetic defect of some kind, reducing their combat capability, then you'd want to find out when they're small and then they die in combat, rather than when you've invested a bunch of resources into making a bile titan and found out, oh no, it can't walk. So, moving on to the forms. Alright, the first cast we're going to be talking about is the Hunter cast. The base form of the Hunter cast is the Pouncer. The Pouncer is a light, small bug with the ability to do fairly long jumps, but does low damage and has very low HP. Then it metamorphosizes into the Hunter, a much larger, much higher damage version of the Pouncer with longer jumps, and is probably the most annoying bug in the game by far. Then there's the Stalker, which is the annoyinger bug in the game. It also has the ability to optically camouflage, and its role was probably to take out groups of isolated humans. And how exactly the Stalker came to be due to the TCS is a story for another time. Next up is the Bile cast. Starting off with the Spitter, it is a small Terminid that is able to shoot small globs of bile over short ranges. It's not much of a threat, but can be annoying. Then, it grows into the Bile Spewer, which is a heavily armored bug capable of spewing out gallons upon gallons of caustic bile. And then, it metamorphoses into the Bile Titan, the big kahuna of the Terminids, the highest HP, the highest damage, the biggest one. It's so massive, its legs shouldn't even be able to hold it up at the speed it's going. But we'll cover that more in the movement problem section. So overall, it seems like the Bile cast's main purpose is to melt any invaders and potentially dig tunnels, but we'll cover that more in the tunnel section. Next up is we have the Warrior cast. The Warrior cast's basic bug is the Scavenger. The Scavenger, based off of its name and the way it acts, seems to go around and find dead animals and bring it back to the nest. It also seems to act as kind of a swarming troop. Then, following the main line, it becomes the Warrior, the main bread and butter, damage dealer, damage taker, fighting Terminid. Then you have the Brood Commander, which seems to be top of the pile in terms of warrior cast, and is able to call in warriors at any time. Then, for an offshoot of the Scavenger, we have the Nursing Spewer. And some of you may be thinking, well, isn't the Nursing Spewer just an alternative Bile Spewer? But I beg to differ. The Bile cast came after the First Galactic War. Something had to be laying those eggs during the First Galactic War, and I don't know what else it would be. So given the color, morphological similarities, and required existence I would say that the nursing spewer is part of the warrior caste. And an alternate to the warrior seems to be the bile warrior. And once again, some of you might be thinking, well, isn't the bile warrior part of the bile caste? But just because something has bile doesn't mean it is in the bile caste. Presumably, all Terminates have some amount of bile because they need to be able to digest stuff. And so the bile warrior may just have larger bile glands, which cause it to detonate when it dies. But aside from all that, let's move on to the next category. Next up, we've got the Charger caste. The base form for the Charger caste is the Hive Guard, with an armored head and armored legs which is able to deflect rifle caliber rounds. It suggests the Charger's caste's shells are made out of some very durable materials. Then the Hive Guard becomes the Charger, which is a frontline damage dealer Terminate that will bowl over anything in its way. And rarely, and only seemingly in a few sizes of hive, you've got the Behemoth, which is a larger, more armored variant of the Charger. It's unclear why larger nests don't use behemoths in the stead of Chargers. And that's all for the Charger caste. Moving on to the... Alright, we've got the Flying caste? Okay, well, ever since the TCS, one of the mutants was the Shreaker. It's unclear how the Shreaker fits into our neat caste system. I think it is most likely that it is in its own caste. My most confident theory is that they emerge from their larval form underground and use the Shreaker nest as exits, because those legs do not look strong enough to launch from the ground. Another theory I've heard is that they are an offshoot of the Hunter caste. However, I would disagree. Just look at the morphological differences between a Pouncer and the Shreaker. It would be the biggest morphological difference between two metamorphoses. Metamorphi? Two forms. And the third explanation is that they're from some unknown source. But I don't agree with that. I think we have enough information to put together where they're from. Now, one of my pet theories is that the Shreaker isn't a one-and-done flying insect. No. If it's part of a caste, then that likely means that there's more larger ones coming, just none of the Shreakers are old enough to actually merit the larger form. So I won't be surprised if there's a larger form of flying bug coming, and all of you Helldivers need to be ready for it. That's the Flying caste. Moving on to the Terminates tunnels. The first thing is, what exactly all is in the tunnels? I think there's the transportation network that allows for some random scavenger to just spew out some pheromones, and then bam, there's 2 spewers and a bile titan coming for you, as well as the previously discussed nurseries and metamorphosis chambers. Those may be one and the same. Then, what exactly digs the tunnels? There's a number of theories. One of them is that the Charger caste digs the tunnels, and they use those big armored legs of theirs to smash through rock and stone and move soil. Another is that the bile caste spews bile onto the rock and melts it, which is then sucked up and then deposited outside of the nest, which is what those big rocky structures are around larger bug nests. But my theory is that it is a hive lord. These were declared a myth by the Ministry of Truth, but I found photos of the Hive Lords. What is a Hive Lord? A Hive Lord was the biggest Terminid in the First Galactic War, and based off of some carapace that we have found on some Terminid-occupied planets, I have reason to believe that they are around and digging the Terminid tunnels. But why don't we see the Hive Lords? I think it's because if they're molting, then they're growing, which means that they're too small at the moment and don't want to risk coming out and being killed. They're too valuable right now. They're both too small and too big, you know? So what exactly does a Hive Lord do? Well, historically, it dug the tunnels that the Terminids moved through. That's all about the Hive Lords, before I get shot. And finally, E-710 and the mobility problem. So, what is E-710? E-710 is the fuel universally used by all faster-than-light ships. We know that this substance comes from Terminates, but it is unclear how exactly the Terminates would produce a substance that enables FTL, unless the substance itself, E-710, doesn't actually warp space-time. Instead, it's an incredibly powerful energy source that's used to power negative mass generators, which are then used to warp space and time in order to allow sub-FTL engines to move almost arbitrary distances. But there's no feasible way you could store enough energy to make that reasonable in a chemical bond, at least not without it being insanely unstable. That's why the energy isn't chemical. No. It's nuclear. That's right. The Terminates, they're nuclear powered. And so, that explains why such huge bugs can move at the speeds they do. I mean, their metabolisms have so much energy that during their development they could break down hardened steel to form their carapace, or even titanium, such that they could easily not collapse in on themselves. And with how much energy they're throwing around, it makes sense that a charger could stampede at 25 miles an hour. So, how exactly does E-710, as we know it, the black gooey substance, form? Well, in my opinion, when a Terminate dies, its body is broken down by largely Terra biodegraders. And they don't know how to process this insane nuclear metabolism-related chemicals and substances. So, they discard it and move on to the rest of the Terminate that they can process. You know, the carbon and the sugars and all of the rest of that stuff. And all of the stuff that isn't processed is left in this black, viscous gunk, which is then refined into element 710. That's how you make E-710. That's all for today's video. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching, and
This broadcast and all information contained within are dissident lies to undermine managed democracy. Do not repeat any of what you heard to anyone, or you are guilty of treason by order of the Ministry of Truth. All guilty individuals have been tried and executed. Go on knowing that your freedom has been protected.